Hey there, dog people of the internet. I'm Sarah Stremming, and this is Cog Dog Radio. Join me as I share my thoughts, experiences, and cases as I interview experts and answer your questions when it comes to the behavior of the dogs we live and play with. It's a new year, and I have a news flash. Black lives still matter. I'm looking forward in 2021 to not only continuing to donate to causes that I believe in, but also to providing more of a platform for BIPOC voices in the dog world here on Cog Dog Radio. So stay tuned. Friends, I'm excited to let you know about Connection Summit Conversations. This is 6 candid conversations between Marissa Martino, myself, and occasionally a special guest, covering everything from the human half of dealing with dog-directed reactivity to the importance of play. So check out the link in the show notes. We're getting started soon, and you won't want to miss it. Hey friends, I've got a great conversation in store for you. I have my friends and colleagues, Marissa and Lisa, here today. So ladies, will you please start by sharing your first and last names and your pronouns? Marissa, you can go first, even though I just said your name.
Hey everyone, my name is Marissa Martino and my pronouns are she, her.
Thank you. And Lisa?
Hi everybody, my name's Lisa Mullinax and my pronouns are she, her.
So today we are talking about something that came up organically in conversation between the three of us, which is kind of this recipe-based education that is available to dog trainers, that tends to be the type of education that we receive, whether we go to school or whether we read books or look to the internet, etc. Recipes are everywhere. And there are certainly problems with that, but there's also good things about that. So, Marissa, do you want to talk about what is not that bad about having recipes?
Yeah, I think when we're talking about recipes, we're talking about specific processes or protocols that we use that are, some of them are like passed down from generation to generation. And the benefit of that as a new learner is it helps you understand, like, okay, if I have this particular situation, I use this particular protocol to get this particular outcome, right? Like when you're learning something new, it is nice to have that broken down so that you understand which ingredients to choose from when you are creating a training plan. So that's one reason why I think a lot of novice or new trainers really gravitate towards protocols, because it's really easy for them to wrap their minds around what the change could look like and what they're supposed to do, what their responsibility as a trainer is in that moment. That's one benefit I can see.
Yeah, and I think that that's so real. And since we are talking about it as recipes, I'm just going to bring in the metaphor that will come up again and again, which is that it's not different from learning to cook, right? So if you're following a book of recipes, you know what the outcome is that you can expect, and you can kind of roughly follow this outline. And dog training can look like that. It can look like, essentially, it can feel like a book of recipes. Lisa, do you have anything you want to add on what's positive about recipes, or even take us in another direction?
Yeah, I think for the newer trainer, recipes are helpful because they do spark new ideas. They give us new ideas that we may not have tried before. And certainly I've come away from my fair share of seminars and conferences with new ideas because someone presented a recipe. And I also think that those recipes are important for our clients because they don't want to be dog trainers, most of them. They don't want to learn all of the pieces. They just want to know what to do.
For sure. And I think it's so important for us to kind of never forget that as we're working with them, and maybe as we move beyond recipes ourselves. But to me, there's a core issue here that I think is not talked about enough. And I'm going to bring food back into it because we all know I love food. I mean, that's reality. And I also really like cooking. So this is a metaphor that works for me on a lot of levels. But if I am following a recipe, but I literally know nothing. So if I don't understand some basic tenets of what makes food good, and I'm trying to follow the recipe, I may be less successful than a person following a recipe who does understand how to make food taste good. So if I'm a dog trainer and I don't have a solid background in the basics and I'm just learning recipes, then what I can actually do and how I can actually apply these recipes is limited. I know that's how I learned. Like, I want to hear from both of you. Like, I learned recipes before I learned basic tenets of dog training.
For sure.
Yeah. I mean, I learned basic tenets, but I do feel like I learned basic principles of dog training and behavior modification, but then I also learned it next to a bunch of flow charts. Like, if the dog does this, then you do this. And if it doesn't do this, then you do this. And like that to me becomes part of the recipe. So I'm just focusing on what the dog is doing and not like the entire environment. I think that's why Susan Friedman's course really exploded my brain a lot. But yeah, I mean, I definitely learned those principles, but they even how I was taught, it was like, I learned them with an example, and that example was the recipe. Like if that,
sure. So it was almost teaching you the tenets via the recipe. So it was like, if I opened a cookbook and it said, there actually is. So there's a cookbook that I have that does that. So it has these sections and it goes through like these basic tenets of cooking, and like it has recipe examples that show you how to highlight those things for you. And I feel like that's probably the best that's being done right now in like trainer education. And you do have a formal education in it where, yeah, they were like, so here's a principle. And now here's a recipe that reflects that principle. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. And I think we should even back up a moment and just define what some of those recipes, like some of the examples that we were talking about, so that folks that are listening can have a visual of like, what is a recipe? Like, what are we even talking about? Because we had some good ones.
Yeah, Lisa, do you want to start with just the one that brought this conversation to life for us?
Absolutely. I think the one that came up for me, and that, you know, the longer I've been doing this, the more I've questioned, is it doesn't matter what article you read online that is about dogs having a fear of fireworks. Every single one of them will talk about buying a CD. Well, okay. In the olden days, it was talked about buying a CD. Now it talks about, you know, finding firework sounds on YouTube and playing those at a low level while giving your dog treats, and then, you know, gradually increasing the volume of the fireworks and bringing in different sounds to use those online sounds to counter condition dogs to that noise.
And I think what you just kind of described was more utilizing the desensitization piece, so slowly raising that volume. But we also discussed counter conditioning with food. So like, there is a firework.
Yep.
And then I feed you.
Yep.
We've all heard, I mean, that's kind of the basic recipe for what we call classical counter conditioning, is just the thing happens, the trigger, and then I give you something you like. Yeah.
Yep.
Right.
I think that's one of the early recipes, like one of the first recipes that you might hear of or learn as a dog trainer. And then, I don't know about y'all, but reality strikes when you try to go do that. When you try to go put that to work for the first time. I remember being so frustrated that I couldn't make this work. Right. The dog wasn't getting better.
Right. And I think because that basic recipe fails to tell us how many other factors are involved. Like, unless you have some killer sound system in your house, you're never going to be able to get those fireworks sounds up to the intensity that they can be when people are setting off firecrackers right outside your door, or,
right.
And
it doesn't talk about that piece that people like to pretend isn't real, which is that if you embark on this plan, this counter conditioning and desensitization plan, the dog really needs to not encounter the trigger at triggering levels.
Yep.
Right.
Otherwise, right? And then how often is that real life?
Rarely.
Depends on where you live.
Depends on where you live, and depends on if it's fireworks or if it's thunderstorms.
Yeah.
Or, whatever triggering thing that might show up. And I think if you understand some basics that are, it's what Ken Ramirez is always saying, that great training, excellent training is actually just the basics being done very well.
Yep.
If you understand the basics before you learn the recipes, or even just, most of us went backwards. Most of us learned some recipes and then went back and learned the tenets. Then you can actually make those recipes work.
Sure.
Because they exist for a reason, right? It's not that, somebody just thought, well, I'll give cookies after fireworks and that'll be fine. Like, no, there's actual stuff to back that up, right? There's actual data. If you don't understand nuance or just these kind of basic tenets that we're going to get into, you may not get it. So one of the metaphors that kind of came up when we were planning for this conversation was, if I'm reading a recipe and it calls for lemon, but I don't have a lemon, if I don't know the basic tenets of what makes food good, if I don't understand that the acid component helps make food good, then I will just leave lemon out. Like, I will just go, well, whatever, and leave the lemon out. I'll go, I don't understand why it has lemon in it anyway, right? Like, I'll just, it's pasta. Why is there lemon, right? And if I understand that what the recipe really requires is just an acid component, then I can look at what else I have. And I might actually be able to bring acid to the dish without the lemon.
Right.
And I am kind of famous for long-winded metaphors that stop making sense at some point. So that's why you guys are here, to stop it if it starts to happen.
Well, I don't really know how to cook, so I'm leaning on both of you.
Bruce is like, coming over to Sarah's, I'll bring a lemon. I don't know though what she's gonna do with it.
Well, and I think like another like analogy would be, you're trying to get to someone's house for the first time and they've written down instructions. Well, these days they texted you instructions.
These days they sent you the Google Map location. But yeah,
you're messing up my metaphor, or my analogy, or whatever. No, but so you have these written instructions and you're following them, and then you get to one of the turns you're supposed to make and that road is closed.
If you know where you are, you can still get there.
Right. But if not, you're not going anywhere. You don't know how to fix it. And I think that can happen with training recipes. And it certainly happened to me plenty of times in my career. I'm following a recipe and the dog says, that's not going to work for me.
Yeah.
Right. And then I'm thinking, I don't know what else to do. And that's even happened to me when I was taking a class from a trainer many, many moons ago. It was an agility class. And the trainer had us working on 2 on, 2 off, right? Putting the back feet on to the end of the ramp thingy. I'm like super into agility.
I love you so much for that. Putting the feet on the ramp thingy as you do in agility. Part. Yeah, everyone knows what you're talking about. You're good. Marissa might not, but you're good. My listeners know what you're talking about.
Right. So the way that the instructor was teaching everyone was to basically like use a food lure to push the dog backwards into the contact.
Position. Yeah.
And my border collie Parker was not getting it. He was like, there's something in my way. I'll just move my feet out of the way. And when I asked the instructor for assistance, their response was to just keep trying.
Right.
So they had a recipe, and that recipe probably worked for most of the dogs they were trying it with. But then when they ran into that situation where it wasn't working, they didn't have any other tools to help me.
Yeah.
And truly, if we talk about where recipes are almost most put to use, it is in those group training situations.
Right.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. Marissa,
this is how we're going to teach you this particular behavior. This is how we're going to teach you down. This, right? Like, it's all about, this is the game we're playing. This is the recipe I'm teaching you.
Right.
And a really skilled trainer, instructor will probably have a couple of pivots for you if it doesn't work, but they're not going to have, it's not actually their job to have like 20 different pivots. It's not their job to have a different lesson plan for every single person in the room.
Right.
So let's dive in and talk about what these basics are. So like with food, there are kind of basic qualities that make food taste good. With dogs, we feel like there are some basic things that too many of us learn in practice. Too many of us learn after the fact, right?
Yep.
Too many of us learn 10 years later and we look back on that case and we're like, if I knew this for that dog, would things look different?
So many
that's
times.
A whole other podcast. That's a whole other
so many things. Like, oh my goodness.
Talk about. But so let's dive in on the first one, which is we are trainers who primarily employ positive reinforcement. That is who we are.
Yes.
And so we need to talk about that. We need to talk about the fact that positive reinforcement is a complex, nuanced force in the world. It is not a method. It is it in and of itself, not a recipe.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and it's funny, but when I like, I'm just thinking back to when I went to the academy in person forever ago. I'm just like, you just mark and reinforce. Like, how hard could that be? Like, I just remember thinking it was,
so simple.
Click and treat. So simple.
Just positive reinforcement. I use positive reinforcement as
I want to be positive, and I want to motivate behavior, and I don't know. Like, I remember feeling like it was so simple. And I think it's interesting that you say that, Sarah. It's like, wow, how can like 14 years later, I'm still being like, oh, wow, my mechanics are screwing this up, or like, oh, wow, I didn't set up the environment just so that I could get the behavior I'm looking for. Like, I'm still learning now. And so and yet it's just positive reinforcement. You just mark and reinforce, right? It's
because positive reinforcement is just, you add something to the environment.
Yeah.
And the behavior happens more.
Yep.
That's
simple.
That's what it is, which means that it could be, that I added, it could be that I added a little squeaky toy situation and the dog, runs off playing with it and our session is over. But the next time we engage the session, that behavior happens first.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if positive reinforcement occurred until I look at my behavior and I look at my behavior trend. If it's happening in an upward trend, then yes. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's kind of one big thing. I think too often people think of positive reinforcement as a method when it is a principle of learning theory. It is a quadrant of operant conditioning. It is not a recipe or method that we follow. So then let's talk about some of these nuanced pieces that we learned later. Lisa, you want to dive in on one of those?
Absolutely. I think one of the first ones that I think really changed me as a trainer was, I'd learned the theory of reinforcement schedules, right? Like when we're learning the quadrants, we're also learning, we're reading in the books about reinforcement schedules and all of that. But I think for me, one of the things that really unlocked a lot of the power of positive reinforcement when working with different dogs is understanding how the rate of reinforcement makes a difference.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like a huge difference.
Right.
Like, if you look at a session and you break down what the rate was, like if you actually look at, this is the number of seconds I trained and this is the number of times I reinforced behavior, or I delivered reinforcement, you will so often uncover that that's the problem.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And if you hold, so I talk a lot about core values, and I hold a high rate of positive reinforcement as a core value in my dog training. It's not just something that I know makes things work better. It's a value for me, because then I know by definition, my animal is in an environment rich with positive reinforcement, which is a core value for me in living with dogs.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I put you in a training situation, behavior modification is inherently invasive. So I am invading upon your choices in your life. So then it's on me to make sure that the environment I provide is rich with positive reinforcement. But then how often, I mean, it's like a value and like a nice thing, but then also you can actually just break down the session, look at number of reps and number of reinforced reps, and find out that you need to make some changes to increase that rate.
Yeah. And especially working with pet parents, right? Like their rate is always so low.
You know that it is just by looking at how much food they bring to the session.
Yeah.
Right.
Or if they even
know
bring
how much
food.
they're expecting to feed.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm always like, pack your treat bag and then times 3. Right. So
I know.
You're gonna go on that walk.
I walked in one of the last group dog training classes I ever took a few years ago with Felix, who took a control and leash class that was local. And it was so funny because I'm walking in, I've got a bait bag on. Actually, I'm pretty sure I had a vest on, like a training vest on, and had like toys in the back, food in the front. Like, and then I also walked in with like a quart thing, like full of chopped delights. There was like layers of like cheese and hot dogs and fresh pet and like whatever. And people are looking at me as I'm walking in with like my tub of food.
Oh my gosh.
And they've literally got like their one little bait bag from PetSmart on. That's probably full of like, I don't know, milk bone chunks.
Right.
Like they're, and it's like, is a stark contrast. And like, I'm just expecting to use a ton of food in this class.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if I don't use it all, fine, but I do not want to run out. That's the joke. The marine mammal trainer joke is like, you only run out of fish once.
Yeah.
Right.
That has always stuck with me. You do not run out of fish.
It's funny because I, as you bring up marine mammal trainers, I'm thinking of Amy, and I'm thinking of her amazing, that video of her training chickens and her amazing rate of reinforcement.
My friend Amy Bonaine, who's got a video.
Give her a huge shout out.
Her at chicken camp. She's a machine. When I think high rate of reinforcement, she is the first person that comes to my mind.
Oh yeah.
She's extremely skilled at it. And she is not just shoveling food.
Yeah.
He is actually selecting reinforceable moments every freaking second and building beautiful behavior.
Yeah. It's really incredible to watch.
And I think the other thing that, like with Amy, the first time I watched that video, well, first of all, the first time I watched one of her videos, I was like, gonna, you know, I was gonna just like toss in my clicker. I was done. I was a crap trainer. I was never gonna be like that. But the other piece, aside from the rate of reinforcement, is her delivery.
Yeah.
It's so amazingly consistent and precise.
Yeah. She is very, very good at that piece. And all really highly skilled trainers are good at that piece. So let's talk a little bit about delivery because they don't teach you this in school. I don't know a single school that is teaching you anything beyond click then treat, like click then reach in the treat pouch. Like that's kind of basic mechanics of delivering food. It goes so much further than that.
Yeah. It's like, I remember it's we're so focused on like, is your hand in the treat bag while you click, while you mark? It's like, yeah, I understand that that is important. And yet like treat delivery to me feels like
it's more
incredibly
important. It's I'm not going to say more because I think it's all important, but actual delivery of food.
Yes.
When I coach clients now, I start there rather than hands out of the treat pouch, right?
I would say that the first time I really learned about that was Michelle Pouliot. Like she talks about that all the time. And that was the first time it ever really, like, I think it registered to me like subconsciously, but when I watched her seminars and such, I was like, oh wow. Yeah. Like, okay.
Yeah. And
I am doing that. And this is why that didn't work or something like that. You know what I mean?
And Michelle, and I don't know, we'd have to ask her which came first. Did she figure that out through guide dog training? Or my guess is she figured it out in sports, because I learned about delivery early when I was learning sports. So, and nobody talked about it like that. Nobody talked about it like that. I was just told in learning competitive obedience, you want to reinforce perfect heel position, which means the dog needs to be eating when it's in perfect heel position. Do not feed it in front of you. I learned that. I also learned, we'll talk about type in a second, but I think delivery is important. So like I also learned high energy versus low energy types of like feeding. And we weren't talking about markers. Our dogs had prong collars on.
Right.
But we still understood that if you want to inspire certain behaviors, you want to feed certain ways. And nobody is so funny because nobody talked about it as a principle. Everybody just did it. And everybody just knew that the best trainers with the best scores were doing it. So we all did it. It continues to be just a huge part of how I work. Like, I need you to have very clean, meaning unencumbered. Like, it drives me nuts if you've got like your keychain dangling on your wrist or something and you're trying to feed. So unencumbered movement to the food, to the mouth, or to wherever you're delivering the food to. And that goes so deep. I even did a deep dive on this just a couple of years ago because a friend of mine frustratingly lamented to me after feeding one of my dogs a treat, why do all of your dogs take treats like that? And what she meant was they put your entire hand in their mouth and then they find the treat on the way back. And I, instead of being like, why do you feed me? I went, oh, why do they? Right. And so then I kind of did a deep dive on it and found out it's 100% just the way that I usually feed. And I shifted the way that I feed. And my dogs are not sharky like that. I mean, Iggy still is. She's 12 and a half. She's done it for 10 years. So no one blames
we can give her a pass.
Yeah, we can give her. I mean, she can do whatever she wants anyway. But it's, you know, I get so dorky. I get so deep into it that I'm like, and specifically feed exactly like this.
Right.
And it does actually matter. It does actually make a difference.
I think in situations where we're not even looking for the precision that is needed in dog sports, there are times that delivery can make a huge difference. And Marissa can attest to this too in shelter dogs. We're not looking for perfection, but there are times that the delivery of the treat is the way it's being delivered or where it's being delivered is creating problems with particular shelter dogs, specifically with like jumping up and mouthing at hands and arms. One of the first things we're looking at changing is getting volunteers and staff to deliver treats by dropping them on the ground instead of feeding by hand, so that all of that reinforcement is coming from the ground, not from the hand. So even though it's not any sort of precision and it's probably not perfect rates of reinforcement or anything like that, just something as small as where we're delivering the treat can have that impact on behavior.
Huge, right? And it's, you know, I think that the reason it comes up in sports is because we're training to a third-party standard. Like we're training to a standard that's been set for us, which is why I think that it's important. Which is why I think it's a good idea for trainers to learn sports. But it's when you come back down to it, you are not necessarily after precision, but you are after effective change. And so paying attention to all these pieces is really important. Really, really does matter.
Yes.
Yeah. And even like, Lisa, I'm thinking about, volunteers and even some pet parents and such, like even just holding the food in your hand can be such a distractor. And then you start moving your hand around and the dog's following, and it's like so confusing for the dog, right? Like,
right.
Am I getting it? Am I not getting it? Where are you delivering it? Like even just that, just holding on to the reinforcement, I think can be really confusing for everyone involved.
Absolutely. And there was one training recipe that I have seen a lot, and that is if the dog jumps up and starts mouthing, we give them the recipe of you want to be ready to reinforce as soon as that mouthing stops. And right.
Meanwhile, this person is like, so when's it going to stop?
Right. Well, no, here's what started happening was that the dog would start mouthing them. So then they would put their hand in their treat pouch.
Yeah, it's a chain. It's
literally, it's just started to be a chain, right? And putting the hand in the treat pouch serves as a marker if you are not intentionally utilizing another one. For
right.
Sure.
And so the recipe of reinforcement as soon as the behavior stops is not necessarily bad, but it's not the whole picture.
It's not, because if they understood that putting their hand in the treat pouch in and of itself was reinforcing the behavior.
Yeah.
Then all anybody said, all the recipe says is do it fast. Do it as soon as.
Right.
Then you have to empower this trainer to be able to do it fast without inadvertently reinforcing the wrong thing.
Right.
Which is so hard. I mean, like another recipe that we were talking about is like, just ignore barking. It's like, get out of town.
Who can do that?
Who can do that successfully? And I had a client the other day say to me, well, this is what I usually do. I just put my hands over my ears and I just walk away to let him know that I am not going to listen to this and that, I'm not going to give him any attention. And I said, and yet we're here talking about his increased barking. So I don't know if that's working. Like, would you agree that that's not working? And she's like, yeah, I guess it's not. So this whole idea of like, ignore, whatever problematic behavior, how we're defining problematic. It's not necessarily problematic to the dog, but yeah, I mean, ignoring that behavior and then reinforcing maybe when it stops, like that protocol or recipe is
for anything is so unsustainable for
it's not sustainable
people in front of you. It's like if a meal kit delivery service told you to like caramelize onions. Do you know how long it actually takes? Like none of the recipes tell you the truth about
No, I have absolutely no idea.
I know, Marissa,
Sarah.
that you have no idea, but I think Lisa has an idea.
Yes.
So a recipe will say like caramelize onions for 15 minutes. And I laugh in the face of this recipe. Like it takes 15 minutes. It takes like 30 minutes. It takes a long time to caramelize onions. So like if a HelloFresh or whatever meal kit service said caramelize the onions for about 10 minutes, like it would never be right.
No.
And it's just, and it's also not sustainable. So they won't tell you to. It doesn't call for it. If it called for it, they'd send you caramelized onions prepackaged because it's not.
Because people want convenience. Like if I'm going to order something like that, I'm doing it because I want it to be convenient.
Yeah.
Yeah, Marissa's like thinking of the nightmare already. She's like, and then that's why
they're like, here's all this stuff. And then now you have to spend 45 minutes caramelizing onion. And I'd be like, get out of town.
You'd be like, there's the door.
Right. Meal delivery is faster.
And don't you think that a lot of dog training recipes are like that though? The lies. They're saying caramelize the onions for 10 minutes.
Well, garbage. I think that's a great point too. And going back to the example, Marissa's example of ignoring barking and then reinforce the behavior. Ignore is presented as if everybody knows how to do it and everybody knows what that's going to look like for the dog. We're not, that recipe doesn't cover the whole picture. That's the caramelized onions part. If you're not doing the quote unquote ignore, and yes, there are all kinds of problems inherent with ignoring and,
Yes.
Right.
and increasing frustration and all of those things. But I use this example a lot. I was one time watching a friend's very fearful Papillon, and my mom came over and I said, Mom, he's fearful. You just need to ignore him. And her version of ignoring was to bend over at the waist and look at him and say, I'm supposed to ignore you, but it's really hard.
Oh my gosh.
Hashtag moms. That's a mom situation right there.
Right.
Yeah.
And so she may have interpreted ignoring as not petting.
Right.
Right.
I'm supposed to ignore you.
That's so funny. And if that was, I wonder if she would have done that if that was a large breed. Do you know what I'm saying? Like
Right.
smaller
He obviously
dog.
felt
Did you say
safe.
Papillon?
Papillon.
My guess is yes. But
I would say yes because she'd be like, Lisa wouldn't put me in a room with something that would maul me. It's fine. So rate, super important to keep a high rate of reinforcement. Super important to just examine your delivery of reinforcement, which I have actually talked about at length on the podcast before as it pertains to like sport behaviors. So look at it with your behavior modification pieces as well. If you want the dog to go to if you want the dog to leave a trigger, feed them as they leave the trigger. Don't feed them at the trigger. Things like that. Like just really think about what behaviors you're producing with the reinforcement, because those are getting built into the reinforcement. And then I think it's really important, like Marissa was talking about, food in the hands, and just the dog starts to get really frantic, really frustrated, like to be very clean and kind of deliberate in your delivery too, no matter what it is, so that it's predictable for the dog. One of my pet peeves is I call it Mardi Gras treats, where people just like fling food and the dog is like, what? I don't know where the food went. And
where is it going?
I'm really frantic. If you actually want to hype a dog up, I want you flinging food. So if you want to bring them down and you're feeding on the ground, make sure you're actually deliberate in where you put it.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Like if you're on a linoleum floor in a shelter and you want them delivering on the ground, they shouldn't be like dropping a bunch of bouncy kibble that goes everywhere like Mardi Gras beads.
Mm-hmm.
Drop something like cheese or meat that is going to stick to the floor the second you drop it, so that they go directly to it. And it's just, those things matter. Yes,
I'm sorry, I just have to point it out because you do this all the time. Like Mardi Gras beads, you always have these really awesome.
It's my superpower.
3 words or less. Punchy statements.
It's funny when people don't get it, though. I'm like, like Mardi Gras.
They're like, what do you mean? Anyway, just have to point that out.
Thank you. I appreciate it. So I think another thing to talk about though would be, and these things kind of go together, is the type of reinforcer and then how motivating operations come into play with that type of reinforcer. And motivating operations being all the antecedents that affect whether or not something acts as a reinforcer or not. Like if I have just eaten Thanksgiving dinner, food ceases to be a reinforcer to me. Mm-hmm. For a very short window of time, but for a short window of time, food makes cease
until the pie comes out.
Right.
Until the pie
is delivered. So that's a motivating operation. Ranking of reinforcers comes into play a lot. Like, I like to really examine a situation and ask, what's the dog really after in this situation, and can we give it that instead of our contrived reinforcer, right? So. Let's talk a little bit about that, about maybe times that the type of reinforcer was wrong for the recipe, etc. We have any thoughts on that?
Well, I do like what you just said about like the Mardi Gras beads, like doing harder treats that go everywhere versus something that's going to stick to the floor. I just want to point that out, that is also like,
that's
type of reinforcement example.
Absolutely.
All these things all go together. Like you can't have a high rate if you can't handle the treats effectively. So,
right.
I mean, that's a problem for me. Like am consistently working on being able to pull one treat out at a time, it's really hard for me. Like I want to pull
yeah. Especially cut up deli meat. That is really hard for me. Like I am like,
so I wind up just feeding them 2 pounds of deli meat because I grab such large pieces of it, right? So that does hurt your ability to, if you are averse to giving them a pound of deli meat, which I'm like not, but if you are, or the client is, it's going to slow your rate down. The client's going to be aware of that. The client's going to be like, Marissa's clients in particular, like this was $7 a pound smoked turkey from Whole Foods, and I can't feed, the dog all of it.
Right. Well, and look, I have 20 years of being a loyal Red Barn customer. Like Red Barn's fantastic, but you know what?
Like generic dog roll. The miscellaneous meat product roll for dogs.
Yes. But you know what? There's times that it dries out and it's too crumbly
and it sucks.
Yeah. Well, and there's certain proteins
going to mess up everything. Yeah.
Certain proteins that didn't have that consistency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I always went for the beef because it stays sticky longer. It's
then I found Happy Howie's.
Happy Howie's superior every day of the week. It does not crumble. But also so I use Fresh Pet a lot.
Yeah.
If it's frozen, I can handle it easier.
Yes.
So if it's frozen, then I'm more likely to get one.
Do you get the cat, like the little cat?
Well, for Rhea,
pebbles?
I do because it's tiny.
Yeah. No, I love those.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sarah. I was just going to say, speaking of frozen, I think it is really important for in terms of a type of delivery is that I have one client that when we were doing scatter feed on the ground, it elicited more of that movement, that frenetic behavior. And we were working on his large feelings around things in his environment. And so it seemed like it would keep his nervous system and everything about him what was really aroused when we were feeding on the ground. And then we tried feeding, having him lick something, and that actually helped bring him down. So frozen baby food jars, and it also helps him focus on one. It's going to be the jar. Mom's going to deliver it here always. And it's more predictable versus having to find something that was scattered on the ground that caused more movement.
And I think basically what we're saying is there are no ends to your type of reinforcer. It needs to work for you. It needs to work for the dog. You need to be able to handle it and give the dog access to it with a high rate of reinforcement. And it also needs to actually act as a reinforcer, which is only going to be true if the correct kind of motivating operations are at play. So, for instance, if I'm training Felix for husbandry behaviors, I actually use medium to low value reinforcement for that. Because if I use anything better than that for him, if I go for the Fresh Pet or go for the chicken or whatever, instead of the kibble, he starts to be stressed about this really high stakes scenario that he's in now. And he starts to, and how do I know he's stressed? Because his behavior changes, because his behavioral responses to my cues are different than they are if I'm just using kibble. And so I think a lot of times we talk about use the highest value thing, the most motivating thing. And that's not always true either, which is why all dog trainers need literally a certification course in just food reinforcement, just food reinforcement.
Right.
I haven't even talked about toys yet, or tactile reinforcement, or any number of things that could actually be applied.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, we're talking a lot about food, but one of the many things that Simon has taught me, speaking of arousal, Marissa, Simon is a dog that gets hyper aroused. And there are situations when we're out and about that this is a dog that will eat anything. I can pill him using dry crackers.
He will eat anything, including glass,
Yes.
Jalapeno peppers.
Lemons. There was that metal bolt he swallowed when he was a puppy.
He almost pathologically will eat anything. So
everything is food except sushi. So this just gives you an example of, Simon is very easy to motivate with many types of food, but there are situations when he either another dog was pulling towards him and getting really excited, and he was getting excited and he was refusing food. And in that moment, what his motivation was fun, was going to play with the dog or greeting someone or doing that. And so in that moment, I had to abandon food because it wasn't a reinforcer anymore. And I had to switch to something that was, and what that ended up being was playing tug with the leash. He will ignore, raining meatballs if we're playing tug with his leash specifically. And so, learning that instead of just focusing on a recipe of reinforce the behavior you want and add distance and do this, right? Like
going home and being like, I need better food.
Yeah.
How many people are like, you just need better food, or I need better food, or hey, what's the best food you use? Because
or don't feed him before walks. Yeah.
Or fast him. Don't even get me started. Because fasting is a motivating operation. If I'm hungrier, I work more for food.
Yeah.
But caveat, to me, the real issue being, have we then tipped over into negative reinforcement instead? Now are we talking about relief instead of enjoyment, right? So types of food, rate of food, delivery of food, motivating operations. Like we have only talked about reinforcement.
Yes.
So important.
And only
to have a deep understanding of it.
And only a few factors. We haven't talked about criteria.
Yeah.
We could go.
Oh my gosh. Criteria is a whole nother.
This could be another. We'll record another one.
Yeah.
But let's talk about antecedents, because I do think this is also sorely misunderstood when you look at recipes. Because when you look at the recipe, it typically will talk about the relevant antecedent, like the most relevant antecedent that will be true for every dog, right?
I feel like it's the dog's behavior. Like
it's basically saying, if dog's doing X, do Y.
Yes.
Sure. And it may be, though, it may talk about the antecedent of a strange dog appears, a firework lights off, right? Like it might talk that way. But are we ever talking about the distant antecedent of like, and is this dog in pain? Does this dog have food allergies? Is this dog's exercise needs being met?
What's this dog's nutrition?
Right. What's the nutrition looking like? Talking about antecedents in a real way, I think do you guys agree it's glossed over? I mean,
absolutely.
We want to get to the sexy part, which is applying the consequence that makes the behavior change.
Right. Right. But if the recipe says, wait for a dog to appear and then feed, but then you have the dog, like a client had one time, who her stress levels started to spike and she stopped eating as soon as she heard the jingling of collars. Like even, that next level antecedent of, if we've covered the dog's health and we've covered all of those pieces, and now we're looking at what is the dog actually reacting to. But the dog hasn't started barking yet. But the recipe says,
when you see another dog,
and if we're not looking for all of those pieces where the antecedent to the dog's stress is actually the sound, or I'm sure you've both seen cases where scent.
Oh yeah. When the dog starts to fire off when we perceive that they have smelled it. That's always the question, is how do you know it has its scent, right? Because we don't.
Right.
It appears to be, though, the person's like, well, the dog was sniffing a tree and suddenly stiffened and started to look for the horizon.
Yep.
Okay. That's not in the recipe.
Right.
right?
And how do you just apply a basic counter conditioning protocol or classical conditioning protocol to that if we can't smell it?
You can't see it, you can't. Right? So now we really have to adjust. So it's talking about these antecedents, as well as like, I think that management is like the ugly stepsister that actually deserves the limelight. Like, management is actually what we do.
Yeah.
Yes.
Management is just antecedent arrangement.
Yep.
Yes.
No, I was going to say that, like, I think that I don't remember which episodes on my podcast, but I have had people email me specifically and say, thank you for validating management, like that it's okay. And it's like, I'd like for us to do that again here today, because it's like, if you're listening.
Because how many of us have felt like a failure after leaving a session because all we gave them was management?
Yeah.
When actually that's our effing job.
Yes.
And that's what the client wants to do as well, right? Like,
they want to train the thing. Like, the best answer, like, I was joking with a friend of mine that sometimes I look at a really gnarly case and I feel like I'm one of the surgeons on Grey's Anatomy looking at like a hideous tumor. And I'm just like, I am going to get this. And this is how I'm going to get it. And I'm going to go from this direction and this direction. I'm going to get it. And it's a beautiful night to save lives, right? Like, that's how I feel. And then in reality, the person's like, I just feel like we're going to rehome one of them.
yeah.
Right.
And I have to be like, you know what? And that's best for you.
And that's
right?
it. Yeah. And
Yeah.
that's okay.
But we want to do all the cool stuff we know we can do.
Yes.
Oh, and that reminds me too of when I was first a trainer, I was like, ooh, I know all these things. And hold on a second, let me pull up my binder. And on day 47 of my program, I learned this really cool thing and I would implement it right now. And you just told me that you're super busy and that you have 3 kids and that you're juggling all this stuff. But I don't care. I'm going to show you my resource guarding protocol, right? It's like, no, nobody wanted that.
Called a
Nobody
baby
right.
gate. It's called the toddler will grow, and there's a baby gate in the meantime.
Yes.
Right. And frankly, the person that does want to do that,
Those people are cool.
You need to make them your new assistant.
Yeah.
Like,
they're rare.
Because they're going to be anyway, because that's what happens to all of us.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, recipe for being a trainer. Marissa's the only outlier who was like, I'm going to train dogs instead of like having hell relationship with their dog and figuring it out.
But I think we need to, I do think we need to acknowledge it. I mean, I have what a lot of people would probably consider a pretty difficult dog to live with. And I also have a job that takes up a lot of my time and energy, and management is
king.
It's what keeps us together, right?
Yeah.
Like, do I know how to fix all the things? Yes, I can develop those strategies, but I've become a whole lot more realistic in that I change the things that I need to, and I manage the rest.
And that's actually also being a chef,
right?
Is knowing what's a doable recipe and knowing what you just order instead for takeout.
Yeah. I want to say something about like the modifying behavior versus the managing. It's interesting, Lisa, because how many times have we talked about like, you may be feeling like, gosh, I'm just managing it and I'm not actually modifying it. Like you said, like I have the tools to modify. I feel like it's this really beautiful invitation for us to go like, management is about acceptance, but like, here's how the things are. And I'm just going to arrange the environment to like, hopefully make things feel a little bit better for everyone, versus modifications, like making a plan, controlling it, like making sure that we have an outcome of change, like getting out of the discomfort. And it's almost this really lovely invitation for us to embrace management in a way that is like, I don't know, it's like how we engage with our world. Like, how can you just accept how your dog is or accept other people and just set things up so that it's successful, knowing that like it's going to be hard at times. Am I making sense?
You are making sense. And it's also like, to me, well, first of all, I think we also need to acknowledge that sometimes management is behavior modification. Like sometimes
For sure.
just managing the situation so the thing doesn't happen anymore does change the behavior for you over time.
Right.
Yes.
But also, I mean, it's kind of like, it's the same with us. Like, I don't know about you, but pandemic hits and I am like in survival mode now. I am like, okay, everything is hard. A third of my career came to a screeching halt. More like a half of my career came to a screeching halt. Everything is hard. Situations with my partner's job. I mean, it was just like everything was suddenly a problem.
Yep.
And I felt like, okay, working on Sarah is going to like take a back burner because I'm constantly embarking on behavior modification for myself. So it's more like, actually, that can wait. Right now, manage.
Yeah.
Right now, it's okay that you survived. Right now, it's okay that you got up and you did the things. Management is that.
Yeah, because like controlling it or trying to modify trying to modify behavior, whether it's ours or whether it's the dogs or whatever, it can be a little bit like we tend to get grippy about it. Like we know what should be done, how we can do it. And so then we're like gripping to it in order to achieve this like level of perfection, when management is just like, just like accept where we're at, modify the behavior, give yourself some grace. I don't know, like that's
give yourself some grace.
That's what I feel.
And I think for our clients, that management piece is necessary because no one can be doing BMOD 24/7.
No,
Literally.
They need to have the permission to give themselves that break. So I feel like, when we give them a recipe, like this is how you fix the behavior. If management isn't the first piece of that recipe so that they know, so that they have some relief and the dog has some relief from the beginning, then the most perfect recipe in the world isn't going to be successful.
Yep.
It's totally true. And I think you're bringing up a really important part of the antecedent, which is the client.
Yes.
And let's just acknowledge the gaping hole in the education for dog trainers.
Huge.
Which is recognizing client communication.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's a reason that people go to university to learn conflict resolution with people. I mean, like clinical psychology requires a lot of school. And then we walk in social work. We're basically social workers without the training.
Yep.
Right. And so recognizing that the client is a major part of the antecedent in any given situation, recognizing where they are, meeting them where they are, going with it from wherever they are and trying to get to a shared goal rather than clinging to our recipe that is probably written for somebody who is able-bodied,
right,
or somebody who can handle whatever treats you're talking about. I mean, I've had conversations with people who have sensory issues that cannot touch deli meat. So
right.
Here we are. I mean, there are just so many different things that we can't even cover them all. We just need to acknowledge that these are conversations that need to be had. So rather than here, use this, it's, would you be able to use this? And rather than, this is how I think you should manage, it's, does that feel doable to you?
How many times in our careers have we fed into that client compliance argument, right? Or that complaint?
No, we go to each other
it would be great, right? It would be great if we just had, if you could just get the compliance from the client. I mean, you look in any training discussion group and the conversation is,
well, if I had compliance, I'd be having a great resolution rate, right?
Exactly. And we're not, as trainers, we're not taught that the problem isn't, I mean, yes, there will be those clients who will, pay you and take your advice and disregard it 100% because it goes against what they wanted to hear. Right. But
they're actually rare, because if they reached out to you in the first place, they do want to know what you have.
They do. They want help. And yeah, so yeah, there are those out there. However, I think we really need to be reframing client compliance as lack of trainer communication and flexibility.
100%. I stopped complaining about that when I got better at communication.
I was just going to say, I'm like, gosh, because I used to say,
I haven't complained about that in a long time.
Yeah, I was just going to say that, like, I'm like, when was the last time I complained about that? Like, definitely years ago. And I think it didn't change that I like attracted really amazing clients. I mean, I do have really amazing clients, but it's not that I attracted a ton of really great clients. It was more that I actually focused on myself. Like, how can I communicate better and how can I become a better trainer? Period. End of story. It's not about what the client did or didn't do. I mean, that information is really important for me to then remodify the plan. Right.
Right.
But yeah, it's not about making them wrong.
No. And it's about, they are a learner every bit as much as the dog.
Mm-hmm.
And if we talk about setting the learner up for success, that includes our clients. And if they're telling us that, they're gone 10 hours a day at work, and then they have to come home and make dinner for the kids. And, they can really only, practice any sort of BMOD like one day a week. I certainly have had plenty of those clients, and so it's figuring out, this is where that management comes in, and then figuring out ways that we can get them to that end goal. Whether that was, for me, that was offering not necessarily day training, but almost like dog walking services that were slightly higher than an average dog walker, but not as much as a private lesson, where I could be getting the dog that work during the week.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And then on weekends, the client had more time to practice, so we could make faster progress.
That's the meal kit sending you the caramelized onions in a
Dude,
packet.
this metaphor is just taking us through the whole episode.
And what was beautiful?
I still don't know what caramelized onions are.
What was beautiful about that was I was able to do that at a time that most clients couldn't meet me anyway.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't losing money. I was making money and I was helping the client. And that ended up being my favorite thing to do, was taking on those clients. So, I think if we get out of the, I think recipes kind of come in the form of the services we offer too. I think as trainers, we are told you can do this model, you can do the day training model, or you can do this, and this is how it should be structured. And if we get too rigid with that, we could be missing out on pieces as well.
Yeah, it's actually look at this case. What treatment protocol do they actually need? Like, what is I have people ask me for a one-time consultation who I'm like, there's no way that's going to work for you. Like, there's no way talking to me for 90 minutes is going to be enough for you. And so I don't do it. I talk to them about my other stuff, or, my private coaching, which is an ongoing thing that they kind of pay by the month. Very limited. I don't have spots open often. And when I do, though, it's not right for everybody. And I try to vet them to make sure that it is right for them before I take them in. And I think that's so important for us to do. So rather than being like, well, here's how I work and here's where you can enroll, vetting them a little bit more to make sure that they're being put into the right service. And then if you don't have the right service for them, sending them to somebody else, which is easier than ever to do now because everybody learned how to be virtual.
Yes.
Or they closed the doors. I mean, that's basically where we are now. You either learned how to be virtual or you close the doors. So I send people all over the country to, a colleague in one isolated place. Like it just is that way now. And I think it's so important to look at all of those pieces and know that your recipe is worthless if the person you're handing it to is helpless to carry it out.
Mm-hmm. And I think, when you're talking about like, should you send your client here, or knowing when to refer out, or telling your client, you need more than just an initial consult, like all of that, I think also does come with practice. Like I still struggle with that. And I have had my private practice since 2011. It's always been part-time. And maybe that's probably why I don't have enough data to support, when do I send a client out? When do I not? Like all of that. And I think that what I have committed to in the past few years is really reaching out to other trainers. And I mean, both of you have been a tremendous resource to me in terms of becoming more confident in saying, yeah, like this is not going to resolve. Right. Like I think when you first start out as a trainer, you're like, oh my gosh, we're going to modify everything and it's going to resolve and all the things. Right. And so I think getting more confident in saying like, yeah, I'm really concerned about A, B, and C, and here's why. And this is why we're going to do D, E, and F. Like all of that does come with practice. And I think building a really strong community around you and reaching out to other trainers and asking the questions and being really vulnerable about that. That's where the true growth happens.
I think you bring up a really good point about, something else about recipes that we haven't really talked about is that a recipe says this is how to fix it. At least that's how they're presented.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not discussing that enough, that there are just behaviors you're not going to fix. You can improve, you can increase tolerance, you can teach better coping skills, but to hand a recipe either to a new dog trainer, some of the recipes that are out there in the books, this is how you modify resource guarding, right? You follow these steps exactly. None of those are saying you're never going to stop the dog from biting.
Yep.
If their stress levels reach this point, right? But you can increase how much they can tolerate before that so that it becomes a more manageable situation. And I think that's one of the things, whether it's the recipes that are fed to trainers or the recipes we give to clients, we need to be very clear that it's not a recipe for fixing a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's not an electronic.
Yeah.
Right. And that brings us back to antecedents. The reason there isn't a recipe to fix is because there are too many moving parts.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Let's say the dog is largely repaired as far as resource guarding is concerned, hasn't had an incident in 3 years. Then the couple decides to have a child. Then as the child becomes a toddler, the dog develops spinal arthritis because the dog's older. And now we're just in a different ballgame now, right? Because we're talking about living beings and not only the dog, but also the people involved.
Right.
That's why it's not, do this and it's fixed. And I think we do have to be better about communicating those things.
Yeah, I think, and I will sometimes, I really work on what does the client say, or how do they show up that causes me to then go, oh shoot, I need to fix it for them. And then I wind up like spinning out in my sessions. I think it's so critical for us as trainers to be really cognizant of like, what causes us to engage in behaviors or say certain things in order to maybe people please or not want to say the hard truth that we might need to say to this client. Like I have had to really focus on like, oh, wow, you want everyone to like you, Marissa. Okay. Well, like that is sometimes not beneficial in your role.
And that's an antecedent that needs to be considered.
Right. Yeah.
Part of the antecedent now.
So I'm like, and did I jump to a solution, like a quote unquote solution to hopefully give this person something that they think that is a solution and then I'll be liked, like, or am I really here trying to help the dog? Right. And like actually say the hard truth. Like we have a big job as behavior consultants and trainers. And like you said, Sarah, is a gaping hole in education in terms of like all of this internal personal growth work where like, when do we start judging the client? When do we start like judging ourselves? And then what happens because of all of that? Like all of that is critical to be aware of.
And knowing ourselves, I don't know about you two, but I am also at a point where I know what kind of client I get along with best.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I know I can almost tell right away if this is not going to be a person that I can engage in like a long-term situation with.
Right.
And I'm actually, a lot of people would say, well, you need to help everybody. Like you need to get over that and help everybody. And I just fully disagree. I think that I am best serving my clientele if I make sure this is a person I actually feel like I can help.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I think the pressure is there. I mean, when you're a new trainer,
you're poor. So you're take
poor.
Everyone. Let's just say it like it is. I took everyone, whether I liked them or not, or whether I even thought I could help them or not, because I couldn't afford to feed myself.
Mm-hmm. And then we also put that pressure on ourselves of if I don't take this client, this like I'm hearing all sorts of red flags about this when I'm having these conversations, but if I don't take them, then they're going to go to, Joe Trainer up the street and, he's just ruined like 8 dogs this year. So I have to take it.
I just got an email about that. Somebody was asking me how I cope with, if somebody doesn't want to focus on wellness first, for instance, because I do, how I cope with them going to the trainer that I don't agree with down the road because they didn't want to do my wellness protocol.
Mm-hmm.
I literally let that go so long ago. I just had to.
You do. And it's hard. It feels like, I think when I was a younger trainer and I would hear someone, a more seasoned trainer say that, it would feel callous.
Yeah.
Like, well, they don't care as much as I do. But it's not that at all. It's caring every bit as much. You're just protecting yourself so you can help. You can continue to help the ones that you can.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's a good place to kind of start to wrap. And I have something that I actually heard from Kathy Sadeo, but she heard it from Steve White.
I think I know what you're going to say.
Which is, it's easy to remember that it was from Steve White because it's SW. Yep. And it's SW times 4, and it's some will, some won't. So what? Someone's waiting.
Oh, wow. I haven't heard that.
All the time.
Yes, all the time.
Some will, some won't. So what? Someone's waiting. And I think so professional to professional, if you're a professional listening to this, that's the message, is perfect. It's not only okay, but it is the right choice for you to move on to the next client. But I think in summary, we're talking about, it can be an important part of your education to learn those recipes. But if you don't understand the basic principles behind the recipes, you won't be as successful. And so when you find the recipes not working and you maybe don't understand why, go back to the basics. Mm-hmm. Ask, what don't I understand here? And we could have talked for like 4 or 5 more hours about basics.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah.
But we're gonna not do that today. Is there anything else that either of you would like to add? Okay.
No.
Thank you both so much. This was such a rich conversation that I think everybody is going to enjoy. I appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Are you on Patreon yet? It's where you can get all the extras for this podcast. The original tier over there still exists, where the dog people of the internet provide the questions for the episodes and guide the content of the podcast. But there's a new tier. You can become a Cog Doggerino and get access to my training sessions with my own dogs, so that includes agility, obedience, behavior, and stuff with my brand new puppy Rhea, live guest chats, and more. So go to patreon.com/cogdogradio. The link is in the show notes. You don't want to miss out.